Nada couldn't make it. Glad to see Tunde and Karen volunteers at Nonner. And also thank you to Mark Greenberg of the Jack Street Fund for supporting this work, this research. Okay, so our paper focuses on employment problems that women face in the contemporary context of Mongolia's labor market and opportunity gaps that they experience, which affects not only themselves, but their families and the nation itself. So we draw on a body of literature, as well as our ethnographic and survey research to summarize these issues. And we look at this not necessarily as this deficit, because it's happening in many places of the world, but as a puzzle. So we don't have the answers, but we're looking at gender in these intersecting spaces of migrancy, age, rurality, and urbanism. Okay, so, all right, so the qualitative research, mine, focused on 50 Mongolian women and their internal migrations. So I looked at rural to urban migration, which everybody's heard about, through interviews, maps that they drew of their lives, and photographs of precious objects, artifacts that they brought with them from where they were to Ulaanbaatar. And then a year later, actually in December, this past December, I looked at rural to urban to rural migration, or return or reverse migration. And these were interviews in small towns and provincial IMSC centers, Kharkov, Suzulik, and Hamburg. So Nada analyzed government data over a 5-year period, and she looked at survey data, government data, focused on trends and reasons for unemployment. And she put the data through this thing called a PEST analysis, which stands for political, economic, social, and technological factors, to determine the causes of unemployment and to broadly determine influencing factors on the problem. Okay, so the problem is women's declining labor force participation. So take a guess really quickly which lines would be female labor participation rates. Any guesses? Which colors? Yeah. Yes. So we examined how Mongolian women's low participation in the labor market, which has fallen with each passing year and now hovers in the very low and even under currently the 50% range, has come about in societal beliefs, practices, and policies impacting employment status and livelihoods. So it's important to set in place the context where in developing Asia, female participation in the labor market has also dropped and is around 50% range. So this is not only indicative of Mongolia, and we wanted to give that regional perspective as well. However, in Asia, 50% compared to 80% of men, are working. So Mongolian women's, the interesting thing is the high educational levels, which has been touched on, is inversely proportional to the levels of unemployment, which is really high and suggests a de-skilling phenomenon. That's where you're overqualified for a job. You probably know. Okay, so we highlight how women's labor force participation rates have been declining since around 07, 08, and even more recently falling below that in 22 and 23. And there's clearly the COVID issue, pandemic issues factor in there. And these are also factors, the declining labor force participation rates are factors for why the informal economy has just risen in Mongolia and all over the world. And it's a major component of the economy now in Mongolia. Okay. All right. So this is the phenomenon we're looking at, the unit of analysis. So we're looking at gender gaps and wage gaps for women in the contemporary labor market. Well, while we're looking at the workforce and economy, we're also acknowledging the ecological, climate change, social, historical, and political forces. Migration is huge and affects many aspects of women's lives. But we frame the larger picture of the workforce with regard to gender discrimination. So there's many legal mechanisms in place in Mongolia, but there's few enforcements, and this is a problem, to protect women in the labor force. And these laws also have been critiqued for gender differences within them. If you think of women's retirement age, you probably know it's 55 versus 60. Also, an interesting thing is when women's maternity benefits end and they go back to work, it's as if they're still not caring for their kids. So that's also an interesting thing. All right, so discrimination in employment in practice happens across women's life cycle, often getting asked maternity questions in interviews, for example, or on the opposite end. I saw this in one of the World Bank reports, women not being hired because they look too old, or, if you talk to so many Mongolian women, they will tell you that after 40, it's tough to be in the job market. Another huge factor is sectoral segregation. So Baatarjavyn has done a wonderful analysis showing the mining and the mineral-based, resource-based economy and really taking over has dominated, and this is a place for usually men's employment, which has then increased. So that's also another reason for what looks to be declining and men's raised employment. So women working in the service sectors also are notorious for lower pay, and so there's a pipeline issue going on. Even women studying tend not to study in STEM fields, which then creates that gap, with regard to mining, finance, computer science, and all these lucrative industries that tend to attract, it's more male dominated. Okay. Underemployment and de-skilling. Women's human capital is relatively high, and that falls short for their employment opportunities. So you see this in a lot of emerging countries where women are more likely to get educated and then they migrate, and that's called positive selective migration, because the labor market isn't really. Can I have a water? Sure. One of the major reasons for unemployment is retirement. Obviously, if you're retiring at age 55, studentships. There's a ton of universities, both public and private growing, which is a whole nother kind of paper in and of itself. And biggest one after that, unpaid household labor. I was thinking about pictures I could put here, and, in the background, everyone has these great pictures, and I was like, well, I don't know what I could put, mostly when you see moms and kids together, it's a caring, picture, and it looks wonderful, and it is wonderful, but you know, it does take time and energy. Okay, so again, why? Engendered factors. So again, we're drilling back down into the care economy in terms of what about it. Okay, so again, workplace sectoral factors. There's this feminization of jobs, especially white collar, sedentary. You all mentioned that. And middle management and lower levels rather than top levels. Whereas you have more men in mobile jobs, and that's vertical mobility in finance, construction, as I mentioned, mining especially, and historical factors. You know, during the socialist period, as patronizing as the time it was, there were stronger social and civil protections for women and higher labor force participation, as well as educational supports. And one could say, well, women were forced to work, you know, during that time. And you can make that argument as well. However, seriously, there were more supports for women to work. Cultural factors, I think you all hit that so nicely. Women, there's this idea of women expected to be at home and care, but not only that, manage family dynamics, which takes a lot of time. And this is across Asia. More women are engaged in home-based duties generally, and they've researched this in time use surveys, which are actually really useful for looking at how much time do you spend here, here, and here, for example. Even the movie Barbie tackled this issue, so, you know, like, we know it exists, okay. Policy factors at both ends, again, of women's lifespans and working ages. So you want to say from like 18 to 55, there are going to be, there's going to be discrimination, and you could say disincentives, because maternity pay, as great as it sounds here, is also a disincentive in the sense that, you know, it does keep women at home, but it's far below the minimum wage. So that's something to take seriously. And as I mentioned, education. The labor force capacity is not able to absorb all these highly educated women. Okay, so moving on. So gender norm biases exist all over the world, and they're exported from countries such as ours as a result of globalization, industrialization. Mining is a good example of how an economy can push towards becoming more resource-based, and as a result, creating these kinds of sectoral segregations in the economy. And so because the issue of women's unemployment resulting from heavy amounts of household labor came out in finding after finding in reports, we decided to focus on the care economy, which is the whole kind of informal economy in that home-based system. All right, so we categorize the barriers in terms of these care economy, in terms of familial norms that prioritize the family over the caregivers, neoliberal burdens that shift state responsibilities onto individual women in households, and then citizen biases which discriminate against migrants with regard to work and registration, especially when it comes to accessing services, and the persistence of pronatalist programs that focus on having children but very little on child care and can be problematic for women's careers. So let's just touch on each of these. So familialism is where Mongolia's gender regime really places women as responsible for the management of the family, and in turn upholding the public sphere of the economy and society itself, and this being an invisible backbone. if you will. And in Baatarjavyn's analysis of recent, my co-author, and recent government survey data over a 5-year period, the main reasons that women gave for being unemployed, apart from being students or retired, again, was to take care of children or the elderly, whereas for men, it was being unemployment, that is for men, being sick or disabled. The qualitative interviews, mine, similarly highlighted how especially for example, when women moved far away from their families of origin, there was a lot more pressure for them to stay home with children. And they didn't have a backup. There was no backstop system. That's a long story, but we'll move on here. So, neoliberal burdens. So particularly for low-income, young, older women, single mothers, and rural women, there are scarce social and human services. And out of 2016 data, 33% of children attend child care programs that are eligible. And that means women are more likely to stay home. Again, maternity pay contributing to a cycle of poverty for women due to some of the factors that I previously mentioned. And Baatarjavyn's analysis showed the lack of schools and child care facilities and services and their hours of availability, like mostly from 9 to 5, conflict with women's work schedules too. And that also means that there's more traffic, there's also pollution, and this makes it hard for women to, it's a huge ordeal to just drop off kids and pick them up. It takes a village in a sense just to do that. And then women who lack kindergarten services, nursery services, what have you, don't usually work. And in my study, many participants were spending hours in traffic in Ulaanbaatar trying to manage schooling, childcare, and shopping, working, and they complained about the facilities and all of that. One said, I don't want to stay in Ulaanbaatar. The traffic is terrible, the air pollution's bad, I don't think it's good for my children. Citizen biases, so there's a lot of overcrowding in Gare districts. And women are also less likely to be employed on a formal basis, as the ILO has shown. And Baatarjavyn found that there's a citizen wage gap. Furthermore, internal migrants are often funneled into jobs with the worst conditions. Migrants' monthly salaries, the pay is low at $350, while non-migrants earn about $100 more a month. Registration barriers are huge, and a third of migrant households surveyed in 2021 by the IOM, or the International Organization for Migration, did not possess any city registrations. Okay, there's a lot to say about pronatalist programs, and I don't have to lecture you about the Glorious Mother Award, which most of you, probably all of you, know about. We talked about this in the paper. Fertility rates recently have just surged, and women are having more children, so that's another factor when you look at labor force participation going down. But it also means some of these policies, for example, if you do have 4 children, you can retire early, which then also contributes to women leaving the workforce or moving to the informal economy. And maternity and retirement are interrelated for women in terms of, like I said, having more children, you can retire earlier. And Baatarjavyn found that early retirement, especially women with many children, beginning in the 1960s, continues. The average pension level of women is 23% lower than for men. And this is related to the previous issues of working in lower paying jobs and then getting a lower pension. And the early retirement rate, in a sense, forces women out of the workforce. If they do move into like wanting to become an entrepreneur, they don't have the finances to do a startup. It's also harder to get loans from banks. There are banks now that are stepping in, but it's still an issue. Okay. Is that women's full employment and equal wages in the workforce, thank you, can strengthen their economic households and their sense of decision-making power in their home, and can lead to greater social and political power, and it's good for the nation itself. And the World Bank is all over the fact that if half the population isn't working, the GDP goes lower, so it's only better to get more women into the workforce. So there's that positive relationship. There's Vision 2050, which seeks to tackle these gender barriers in public life and especially in employment, and to align with the Sustainable Development Goals. And again, with Holly and Karen's presentation, women's leadership needs to be obviously worked on here at top levels to bring in more gender-sensitive policies around especially childcare. And so we just looked at three, I'll just end here, three major kind of brief recommendations for changing some of these policies, which stems directly from our research. Ensuring gender equality in the labor market, that we have to address wage gaps. There's a lot in there too. Manage migration by supporting rural development. Now, it's not a panacea, and people will migrate for very complex reasons to the city. But enhancing these social infrastructures and IMSC centers, I think, are really beneficial. And then last, ensuring gender balance in family life. I think everywhere, all over the world, we're working on that, trying to, and creating or reducing or eradicating all these household barriers that will free people to have fulfilling careers and lives and so forth. So I think that's it. Thank you.